Stay with me, because if you are looking at the headlines regarding the Republican Senate conference today, you are seeing a story about personality conflicts and political infighting, but that is not what is happening. What is occurring in Washington right now is not a feud, and it is not a routine partisan skirmish. It is a structural rupture in the governance architecture of the United States. We are witnessing the precise moment where the mechanisms of authoritarian leverage collide with the survival instincts of an entrenched political institution, and the outcome of this collision will likely determine the stability of the American constitutional order for the next decade. This is not about who likes whom. This is about the physics of power, and right now, the physics are breaking. I'm Josh Geo. To understand the magnitude of this fracture, we must anchor ourselves in the specific, time-stamped reality of the event that set this chain reaction in motion, devoid of the speculation currently flooding social media. The sequence of events began with clinical precision on a Wednesday morning that will likely be recorded as a pivot point in legislative history. At exactly 7:43 a.m. in the Russell Senate Office Building, a meeting convened that was ostensibly routine but operationally unprecedented. Three men, Senator John Thune, Senator John Barrasso, and Senator John Cornyn, entered the office of the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell. These are not backbenchers. They are the architects of the Senate's operational strategy, the men who control the flow of legislation, the allocation of funds, and the discipline of the conference. They remained behind closed doors for 47 minutes. We know the physical parameters of the room, we know the players involved, but what matters is the output. 47 minutes later, they emerged, and within the span of 2 hours, the disciplined silence that had characterized the Senate Republican Conference for 8 years evaporated. This was not a slow leak of dissatisfaction. It was a sudden, coordinated, rapid depressurization of the party's internal containment structures. The catalyst was specific. A demand issued by Donald Trump at 2:17 a.m. for an immediate vote on the Emergency Powers Expansion Act, coupled with an ultimatum that non-compliance would be met with a comprehensive primary campaign against every sitting incumbent. This was followed at 6:30 a.m. by the circulation of an audio recording among the senior staff, a recording in which the former president explicitly stated, "I do not need the Senate. These people work for me." By the time McConnell and his lieutenants exited that room, the decision had been made not to negotiate, but to revolt. However, the narrative being constructed by the mainstream press and the cable news ecosystem is fundamentally incomplete. They are framing this as a dramatic episode of Republicans versus Trump, a soap opera of loyalty and betrayal. This is a false narrative because it trivializes the stakes. What is being missed, what almost nobody is talking about, is that this is not an emotional reaction to an insult. It is a systemic reaction to an existential threat. The media sees a political fight. The analyst must see a realignment of incentives. The press focuses on the Greenland rhetoric or the personal insults, treating them as gaffes or eccentricities. This interpretation fails to grasp that for the Senate leadership, these are not eccentricities. They are indicators of unmanageable liability. The story is not that senators are offended. The story is that the cost of obedience has finally and mathematically exceeded the cost of resistance. We need to strip away the personalities and look at the mechanism. To understand why this specific Wednesday became the breaking point, you have to understand the operating system that has governed the Republican Party for the last 8 years. It was a system built entirely on the weaponization of fear, specifically the asymmetric capability of Donald Trump to end a political career faster than the institution could protect it. This was not an ideological alliance. It was a hostage situation maintained by the credible threat of execution. Consider the historical mechanics. In 2020, Mitt Romney voted to convict. The system responded instantly. Censure, isolation, damage. The signal was received by the collective. Deviations are punished. In 2021, Bill Cassidy attempted to navigate a middle path, voting to convict and then attempting to rehabilitate his standing. The system rejected the rehabilitation, backing a challenger regardless. The signal hardened. Loyalty offers no permanent immunity, only reprieve. In 2023, Kevin McCarthy attempted to govern by negotiating a debt ceiling deal, a functional necessity of the state. The system removed him. The signal became absolute. Functional governance is a fireable offense if it contradicts the leader's whim. For nearly a decade, this mechanism of fear was the dominant force in Republican politics. It created a rational equilibrium where a senator's safest move was always compliance. Senators are, by nature, risk-averse actors. They operate on a calculus of self-preservation. As long as the risk of defying Trump was higher than the risk of enabling him, they enabled him. It is a simple equation. What happened this week is that the equation was inverted. The mechanism of control broke because three independent structural forces converged to change the inputs of that calculation. This is where we must look at the systems, not the opinions. The first systemic shift is the electoral math. Power in the Senate is derived from holding seats. The 2024 map is statistically brutal for Republicans, with 23 seats to defend against only 11 for Democrats. In a neutral environment, this would be manageable, but the internal polling data, the hard numbers that senators see but rarely release, shows a degradation of the brand. When a candidate in Montana, Ohio, or Pennsylvania is tied directly to the specific chaos of the last month, their numbers drop by 6 to 8 points. In the razor-thin margins of swing states, an 8-point drag is not a hurdle, it is a death sentence. The realization inside the conference is that the Trump bump has inverted into a Trump tax. You cannot hold a majority if your leader is statistically toxic to the median voter. The second systemic shift involves the defense industrial base and the international security architecture. The Greenland rhetoric is being treated by the public as a bizarre sidebar, but inside the Senate Armed Services Committee, it is viewed as a catastrophic breach of sovereign stability. When a leader threatens military action or coercive acquisition of allied territory, it triggers alarm bells not just in NATO capitals, but in the Pentagon and the corporate boardrooms of the defense industry. These senators are heavily integrated with the defense establishment. They understand that the United States power projection relies on the predictability of its alliances. A retired four-star admiral describing the strategy as instability is not offering a critique. He is defining a threat to national security. The Senate has a distinct constitutional prerogative to advise and consent on foreign policy. When the executive branch threatens to dismantle the international order, the Senate's institutional survival instinct kicks in. They are not defending Greenland. They are defending the concept of the Western Alliance, upon which U.S. economic and military hegemony rests. The third systemic shift is the acceleration of legal jeopardy. This is the mechanism of the state closing in. We are seeing criminal cases move with increasing velocity, emergency stays being denied, and trial dates becoming fixed realities. The senior legal minds within the Republican conference are looking at a calendar that suggests their nominee could be in federal custody by November. This creates a sovereign risk profile for the party. Aligning with a candidate who faces high probability incarceration is no longer a political gamble, it is a divestment from reality. When you combine these three structural factors, electoral toxicity, geopolitical recklessness, and criminal liability, the fear mechanism that Trump used to control the party loses its potency. Why? Because the threat of a primary challenge from Trump is no longer the worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is now the total collapse of the party's governing capacity and the loss of the Senate majority. This brings us to the room with McConnell, Thune, Barrasso, and Cornyn. We have to analyze the psychological and tactical shift that occurred during those 47 minutes. McConnell, the ultimate institutionalist, did not make an emotional appeal. He presented a structural reality. By playing the audio of Trump declaring the Senate irrelevant, he stripped away the illusion of partnership. Trump was not asking for cooperation. He was declaring the obsolescence of the legislative branch. The exchange between Barrasso and McConnell is the pivot point of the entire event. Barrasso, representing the loyalist faction, articulated the old fear: he will destroy us individually. McConnell's retort: "He is going to destroy us anyway," is the moment the paradigm shifted. It is the realization that in an authoritarian consolidation, there are no partners, only temporary tools. McConnell reframed the choice. You can be destroyed while defending a man who views you as a servant, or you can risk destruction while defending the institution that gives you power. The plan McConnell laid out, the letter, the campaign funding, the refusal to vote, was not a protest. It was the activation of the Senate's own nuclear deterrent. By threatening to use the National Republican Senatorial Committee's war chest to defend incumbents against Trump-backed challengers, McConnell was weaponizing the party's financial infrastructure against its titular head. This is institutional warfare. Now we must look at the escalation and the feedback loops this decision triggered. In complex systems, an initial action often produces a counter-reaction that accelerates the conflict. This is exactly what we are witnessing. The speed of the alignment was critical. McConnell calling 15 senior senators was a whip count, a test of the new reality. The commitment of Romney, Collins, and Murkowski was priced in. They are the sunk cost faction, already alienated. But the movement of Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio represents a catastrophic failure of Trump's control system. Lindsey Graham is the bellwether of Republican power dynamics. He does not move based on ideology, he moves based on survival. For years, his calculation was that survival meant proximity to Trump. If Graham has shifted, it means his internal polling and his read of the room tell him that the Trump era of total dominance is over. His statement that he will not defend, threatening to invade Allied territory, is the public rationale. The private rationale is that he sees the ship sinking and is moving to the life raft of the Senate institution. Trump's reaction, the traitor's text, the phone calls, demonstrates the limitations of his toolkit. He attempted to apply the old pressure, "You are dead to me." Graham's response, "Then I am dead," shattered the illusion of leverage. It is the verbal equivalent of a bank run. Once the depositors realize the bank has no money, the collapse is instant. Trump has no leverage over a man who has already accepted his political mortality. The leak of the letter at 3:15 p.m. was a tactical detonation. By making the revolt public, the senators burned their ships. There is no retreat from a signed letter accusing a president of threatening the constitutional order. This forces the entire political ecosystem to react. Watch the feedback loop involving the Democrats. Chuck Schumer's decision to remain silent is a masterclass in strategic patience. By refusing to attack, he denies Trump the oxygen of partisanship. If Democrats attacked, Trump could rally the base against the socialist left. By stepping back and offering quiet procedural support, Democrats force the conflict to remain internal to the Republican Party. It becomes a civil war, not a partisan war. This isolates Trump further, as he cannot use his standard us versus them rhetoric when the them is Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham. The escalation continues with the donor class. The entry of the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers is not a minor detail, it is the capital strike. These organizations represent the flow of money that sustains the Republican ecosystem. Their statements emphasizing constitutional stability are coded warnings. They are telling the Senate, if you do not stop the chaos, the funding stops. In the American political economy, capital demands predictability. Trump represents volatility. The Senate represents, theoretically, stability. Capital is choosing the Senate. This financial pressure acts as a force multiplier for the revolt, giving wavering senators the cover and the cash to stand firm. And then there is the international feedback loop. The statements from the UK, Germany, France, and NATO are not diplomatic pleasantries. They are diplomatic demarches. They are signaling to the US Senate that the executive branch is considered unreliable. This empowers the Senate to act as the adult in the room, further legitimizing their revolt as a defense of national security, not just political maneuvering. We have now reached a point of no return. This is crucial to understand. This situation cannot be rewound. The letter exists. The signatures are on paper. The audio is public. The insults traitors and dead to me have been exchanged. In political systems, once the veil of unity is torn this violently, it cannot be stitched back together. The incentives have been permanently altered. For the senators, backing down now would be fatal. If they retreat after signing a letter declaring Trump a threat to the Constitution, they admit to being cowards who value their jobs over the country. They would be purged by Trump anyway for the initial act of defiance. Their only path to survival is forward, through the conflict, to the total neutralization of Trump's hold on the conference. For Trump, the incentive is total war. He cannot tolerate an independent power center within the party. If the Senate successfully blocks his emergency powers, the aura of his invincibility, the core asset of a strongman, shatters. He must escalate. He must prioritize them. He must burn the institution down to save his own standing. This creates a scenario of inevitable collision. The feedback loops are driving both sides toward a maximum confrontation. The leaked polling data showing a 6-point swing against Trump-endorsed candidates acts as an accelerant. It confirms to the senators that their survival depends on divorcing themselves from the anchor. The staffer revolt, 42 staffers threatening resignation, is the machinery of the party jamming its own gears. A senator cannot function without staff. If the junior staff refuse to work, the office ceases to operate. This is the deep state in reality, not a conspiracy, but a bureaucracy refusing to execute orders it deems suicidal. So, where does this go? We are facing a period of intense strategic uncertainty. There are no clean outcomes here, only varying degrees of damage. We must look at the scenarios based on probability, not hope. Scenario 1 is what we might call the tactical retreat. Probability, low, perhaps 25%. In this version, Trump recognizes the overwhelming alignment of forces, donors, media, international allies, and his own party, and chooses to de-escalate. He drops the emergency powers demand, claims he never really meant it, and pivots to a new culture war issue. The Senate declares a quiet victory and tries to limp through to the election. This is unlikely because it requires Trump to act against his psychological imperative, which is never to show weakness. However, it remains a possibility if the internal financial pressure becomes unbearable. Scenario 2 is the frozen conflict or stalemate. Probability, moderate, around 50%. In this scenario, the revolt holds, the letter stands, and the emergency powers are blocked. Trump rages, holds rallies, and attacks the senators daily, but stops short of a fully funded, coordinated primary war because he lacks the infrastructure or money to execute it effectively. The party enters the 2024 election functionally split. A Trump faction and a Senate faction coexisting in a state of hostile paralysis. This maximizes voter confusion and likely suppresses turnout, but it avoids the total liquidation of the party apparatus. Scenario 3 is the total rupture. Probability, rising, currently 25%. This is the scenario where the feedback loops spin out of control. Trump, cornered and furious, launches a scorched earth campaign. He creates a third-party apparatus in all but name running against the Republican incumbents. The Senate retaliates by formally censuring him or passing bipartisan legislation with Democrats to strip the executive of emergency powers permanently. The Republican coalition fractures irrevocably, leading to a catastrophic electoral defeat in November, but potentially birthing a post-Trump center-right party from the ashes. The most likely path, based on the trajectory of the last 48 hours, is Scenario 2 drifting violently towards Scenario 3. The structural forces, the money, the polling, the legal pressure, are pushing the Senate away from Trump. The psychological forces, ego, fear of humiliation, are pushing Trump to attack the Senate. These vectors do not intersect, they collide. We need to bring this full circle to understand what this means for the broader geopolitical and economic landscape. This revolt is not about a specific policy on tariffs or Greenland. It is a stress test of the American constitutional system. We are watching the mechanism of authoritarian capture fail in real time because the host organism, the Senate, realized the parasite was killing it. The significance of this cannot be overstated. For 8 years, observers have asked, what will it take for the Republican Party to break with Donald Trump? We now have the answer. It wasn't morality. It wasn't rhetoric. It wasn't even an insurrection. It was math. It was the cold, hard calculation that loyalty had become more expensive than treason. The fact that corporate America, the defense establishment, and the Senate leadership have synchronized their movements suggests a systemic immunological response. The institutions of power are coalescing to reject a destabilizing element. But make no mistake, when a system rejects a destabilizing element that still commands the loyalty of millions of voters, the result is not immediate stability, the result is turbulence. The next 72 hours will determine the intensity of that turbulence. We are waiting to see if the number of senators hits 18. 18 is the magic number because 18 Republicans plus the Democratic caucus creates a veto-proof majority for blocking the emergency powers. If they hit 18, the Senate reclaims its sovereignty. If they falter, the revolt collapses and the purge begins. But look at the signals. The donors are moving, the allies are moving, the staff is moving. The momentum is with the revolt. Trump is encircled, and history tells us that when an authoritarian figure is encircled, they do not surrender, they lash out. The Republican Party is currently tearing itself apart to save itself. Whether it can survive the surgery is an open question. We are moving into uncharted territory where the operational unity of one of America's two major political parties is no longer a given. This increases the risk of domestic instability, policy paralysis, and market volatility. I will be monitoring the whip counts, the donor flows, and the diplomatic cables as this situation evolves. This is not just a news cycle, it is a historical pivot. The question is no longer who controls the Senate. The question is whether the Republican Party is still a singular entity. The next few days will provide the answer. Stay alert. But before we conclude, I want to re-emphasize the specific mechanics of the Schumer option mentioned earlier, because this is where the geopolitical chess game becomes most intricate. We touched on the Democratic strategy of silence, but we need to deepen the analysis of why this specific tactical choice is creating a vacuum that Trump cannot fill. In standard political warfare, the opposition provides a foil. By attacking, they allow the leader to rally his troops. Schumer's calculation to offer quiet procedural support effectively weaponizes the Senate rules against the populist narrative. It denies the grievance machine its fuel. This is a level of institutional maneuvering that implies a long-term strategy. The Democrats are betting that a fractured Republican Party is better than a wounded but united one. They are facilitating the fracture. Furthermore, consider the implications of the Greenland crisis on the Arctic Council and global trade routes. We must not gloss over this. The Arctic is the next frontier of great power competition between the US, Russia, and China. When the US president destabilizes relations with Denmark and the broader Nordic bloc over Greenland, he is not just making a real estate pitch, he is threatening the governance structure of the High North. The Senate Armed Services Committee knows that the US position in the Arctic relies on Danish cooperation. The revolt, therefore, is also a move to reassure markets that the US remains a rational actor in the contest for Arctic resources. This is why the Greenland issue resonated so deeply with the likes of Sullivan, Murkowski, and Collins, senators who understand the strategic value of the northern latitudes. It wasn't the absurdity of the purchase offer, it was the strategic incoherence of alienating a key Arctic ally at a moment of heightened Russian naval activity. Let's also expand on the capital strike mechanism. When the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers issue statements on constitutional stability, they are speaking the language of credit ratings and bond yields. Volatility in the U.S. executive branch introduces a risk premium on U.S. assets. If the president can arbitrarily invoke emergency powers to seize territory or disrupt trade without legislative oversight, the rule of law premium that underscores the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency is diminished. The donor class isn't moving because they dislike Trump's tweets. They are moving because they perceive a threat to the predictability of the regulatory environment. They are hedging against regime uncertainty. The Senate, in this equation, is the counterparty offering stability. The flow of money follows stability. This is why the donor revolt is likely to be sticky. Once capital reallocates away from a volatility source, it rarely returns until the volatility is resolved. We must also look more closely at the internal dynamics of the Senate staffers. The 42 staffers signing a letter of dissent are a profound leading indicator. In Washington, personnel is policy. These staffers are the gatekeepers. They control the schedule, the press releases, the legislative drafting, and the constituent communications. When they revolt, the principal, the senator, is paralyzed. This staff revolt suggests a generational break within the conservative movement itself. The younger cadre of institutional Republicans, the ones doing the actual work of governance, are signaling that they see no future in the MAGA ecosystem. They are betting their careers on the institution, not the movement. This hollows out the intellectual and operational capacity of the Trump wing of the party. Without competent staff, a political movement becomes merely a noise machine, incapable of executing complex legislative or political maneuvers. Finally, we need to revisit the leaked polling data, the generic Republican +2 versus Trump endorsed 4. This 6-point delta is the most important number in American politics right now. It quantifies the authoritarian discount. For years, the assumption was that Trump brought a unique coalition that expanded the map. The data now suggests he contracts the map. This turns the entire rationale of the party on its head. Political parties exist to win elections. If the leader is a net drag on winning, the party's biological imperative, survival, mandates the removal of the leader. The Senate revolt is simply the manifestation of this biological imperative. The organism is trying to expel the toxicity to survive the winter. The convergence of these factors, strategic silence from the opposition, geopolitical necessity in the Arctic, the capital strike for market stability, the operational paralysis of the staff, and the undeniable electoral math, creates a formidable structural barrier that Trump has never faced before. He has faced investigations, he has faced impeachment, he has faced media scrutiny, but he has never faced a coordinated systemic rejection by the very machinery required to exercise power. This is the distinction that matters. Power is not just the ability to speak to a crowd, it is the ability to command the machinery of state. The Senate is seizing the machinery. They are locking the gears. As we watch the next 48 to 72 hours unfold, pay close attention to the silence of the other Republicans. There are 49 Republican senators. We know of 17 committed to the letter. We know of a handful of diehard loyalists. The silence of the middle, the senators who have not yet spoken, is deafening. They are waiting to see which structure holds, the old structure of fear or the new structure of institutional defense. As the donor money shifts and the polling leaks, the gravitational pull of the middle will likely shift toward the revolt. The herd moves when safety is established. McConnell, Thune, and Cornyn have established the beachhead of safety. This is a developing structural crisis. It is not a made-for-TV drama. It is a stress test of the Republic. The outcome is not written, but the forces are in motion. Subscribe and stay tuned. The analysis will continue as the systems collide. I'm Josh Geo.